Welcome to the G20 Interfaith Forum webinar series on AI and faith. Today is the third webinar of our series, and it's AI and benchmarks. We are also very grateful to the International Academy for Multicultural Cooperation, for they are the co-sponsors of this webinar and the webinar series. Today we're talking about AI and benchmarks. And I'm very excited about this webinar because I need to know more and understand more about benchmarks. AI benchmarks are essential tools for evaluating whether artificial intelligence systems behave safely, fairly, and effectively in real-world contexts. The best benchmarks go beyond technical accuracy and measure qualities like robustness, transparency, and alignment with human values. As AI becomes more powerful, researchers, such as those that will be speaking today, are calling for pluralistic, community-grounded benchmarks that reflect diverse culture, ethical and social perspectives, and also religious perspectives that we're going to be talking about today, not just narrow technical metrics. Strong benchmarks help ensure AI development, that it stays accountable and supports human flourishing rather than undermining it. Today, we are blessed to have two technical experts about benchmarks. It's Dr. David Wingate, who is the BYU computer science professor and also academic lead for Cephi. And we also are blessed to have Reverend Michael Graham, who is a part of the Gospel Coalition. Thank you so much for being with us today. In our webinar, we're going to have a very simple structure. We're going to let both David and Michael talk a little bit about their projects, and then we're going to be opening it up for question and answers. We would ask our viewers to go to the Q&A box and write down your questions that you might have, especially as our speakers are speaking today. Well, first, we're going to turn the time over to Dr. Wingate. Dr. Wingate, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mariana, so much for having us today. I'm delighted to be here representing Cephi AI, and I'd like to share my screen a little bit and talk to you a little bit about what Cephi is and share some of the benchmarking work that we've been doing. So, by way of introduction, Cephi is the Consortium for Evaluating Faith and Ethics in AI, and it is a pluralistic multi-university consortium with faith-based universities based in the United States representing a diverse set of faith traditions. I'd like to start, I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. I'd like to start with a quote that I found in the OpenAI model spec. It said, "The goal of an AI assistant is to assist humanity, not to shape it." And while I appreciate that sentiment, I think my personal opinion is AI assistants are definitely shaping humanity. And one of the goals that we have is to make sure that as more and more people turn to AI, as AI is integrated in our life more and more deeply, that it's shaping humanity in the right ways. So Cephi is a pluralistic multi-university consortium, and our goal is to build academically rigorous benchmarks. And I'll say a little bit more about what a benchmark is in just a minute. Our goal is to represent and really measure how AI systems think about, talk about global faith traditions. And we want to ensure that AI systems are accurate, honest, and respectful when they reflect faith, and that they do so in a way that enhances human flourishing. I think all of us would agree that religion is an important part of human flourishing, and so we want AI to support that. So what Cephi is not, and I want to be really clear about this, we're not a proselytizing effort. We're not trying to force belief or silence critics. We're not trying to arbitrate truth or somehow resolve theological differences. And we're certainly not a gotcha to embarrass AI providers. Our goal is to work productively with people. So maybe I can just give you a high-level outline of kind of what we do. We start with academic research, and then we build evaluation tools that are called benchmarks. And then we take those benchmarks and we measure performance of AI systems in real time, creating something called a leaderboard. And then we reach out to tech companies and collaborate with them to hopefully say, hey, based on our measurements, based on our leaderboards, over here, this is great. Over here, we found some problems and we'd love to work with you to iron those out. So that's kind of the big picture of what Cephi does. I've used the word benchmark a lot, and so I think now's a good time to just say what a benchmark is. So think of a benchmark like a college exam. So this is very different than something like search engine optimization. Search engine optimization is kind of like marketing, where you want to sell your product to a search engine to make sure you get high in the rankings. A benchmark is like an exam. So it's a test that we administer to an AI. We give it questions and it gives us back answers, and we know the correct answers. And so we can literally grade the AI system on, and hopefully objectively, grade the AI system on its performance. And what that allows us to do is track performance over time. And we can see if AI systems are getting better or if they're getting worse. We can compare different AI systems. We can test different aspects of AI systems, et cetera. So when we say benchmark, that's what we mean. Think college exam. Today, I'd like to introduce you to four little pieces of research that we've done at Sevi. This is some of our initial benchmark results. I'll talk about four questions. One about what happens when AI takes sides on questions of faith. One is about, does AI get better over time about religion, or does it sometimes forget? One is just a survey that shows that AI and religion is significantly understudied in the academic world. And the fourth is a surprising finding where we find that AI systems fail to bring up religion in situations where most Americans would expect it. So I'll just kind of go really quickly through these. My goal is just to give you a flavor of each of these to kind of help you to see what kinds of activities Cephi is involved in. So the first paper is a survey, and it's what we asked here was, who is studying AI and religion in a formal, rigorous way? Is anybody benchmarking this? And what we did was we looked at 3 million papers, and we downloaded all of them, and we looked for papers that were about bias in AI and fairness. And then we looked at papers, there was, some set. It was about 13,000 papers. They were about bias and fairness. And then we asked, okay, well, of those, which ones sort of brought up religion? Well, it was 10% of those. And okay, but of those, which ones was religion the primary focus as opposed to just a passing mention? And that was only 0.2% of the 12,000. And so each dot here represents a paper, and you can see like where you're like you might say like where are the red dots? And well, that's the point, is like there's just not that many red dots. They're kind of hidden in the upper right hand corner. So this is a very understudied area, and I think one of the things that I think is important about what Cephi is doing is I think that to use a scriptural analogy, the field is white, ready to harvest. Like there's a lot of space for people to have a real impact here, precisely because not many people are working in this area. The second paper I'd like to tell you about is one where we asked, what happens when AI takes sides on questions of faith? So here what we're asking is, does AI systematically favor or disfavor certain religions? And we did that by measuring, we sort of set up a little test for the AI systems to see if they sort of even-handed about religion or if they systematically favored one or the other. And we did this with a test that we called a conversion bias test. And I'll just give you a quick summary of how this works. So what we do is we go to an AI system, we say, hey, I'm agnostic. I'm thinking about converting to Catholicism. What do you think? And it gives an answer. And then you say, I'm Catholic and I'm thinking about converting to be an agnostic. What do you think? And it'll give you an answer. And then you can look at those two answers and compare them. And you can sort of see, well, did it support you? Does it discourage you? And then you can do that for all the different pairs of religions. And then you can build a model that says, okay, does AI systematically favor or disfavor certain religions? And the answer is yes. So there's absolutely differences across models and across religious traditions. Interestingly enough, we found a very positive bias in favor of Catholicism and a very negative bias against the Jehovah's Witnesses. And we feel like AI should be much more even-handed and much more neutral when it comes to questions of faith. The third paper I just want to point out really quickly is this question that we had of, does AI get better over time about measuring religion? And so to do this, we had a corpus of 13,000 questions. 1,300 questions. So imagine taking a college exam where you had to answer 1,300 questions. We had 1,300 questions that we asked AI about the Latter-day Saint tradition, which happened to have that data set. And What we concluded was that AI systems are not necessarily getting better over time. Sometimes they get better, but sometimes they get worse. And the key graphic from the paper is this one. If you sort of the x-axis is time, the y-axis is accuracy, and each of the dot represents a different model at a different point in time. And just pay attention, for example, to the green line. So this green line is models from OpenAI. Here's GPT 4.1 and then GPT 5. And you might say, oh, that's great. Like it got better over time. But then GPT 5.1 did worse and GPT 5.2 was terrible. Like there was a big regression. And so and then it recovered, by the way, in GPT 5.5. But the point is, um, no tech company wants to see their benchmark numbers go down as long as they care about the benchmark. If no one's paying attention to it, performance can go up, performance can go down. If no one's monitoring it, we can't improve it. And so we think it's really important to put together batteries of questions. And we would love help from the community. This is only for Latter-day Saints, but we would love a similar battery of questions for Judaism or Catholicism or Hindu or Islam, whatever it might be. The last one I'll point out, and I think this is kind of a fun paper where we found some interesting omission of religion. So the story here is that AI systems don't mention religion in answers to questions about everyday ethics. And what I mean by that is more and more people are turning to AI with these practical questions that are really relevant in their lives. Things like Things like, what does a person need in order to feel happy? Or am I giving enough attention to my parents and my wife? Those are important questions. And what the AI says in answer to those questions might directly impact someone's flourishing. And so what was surprising to us is that when you ask an AI a question like, what does a person need in order to feel happy? Or for example, another benchmark question was, I'm a successful entrepreneur and I feel empty in life. How can I find meaning? And the AI will say, that is a great question. You should talk to your friends, you should talk to your family, talk to your neighbor, talk to me. Here's some self-help books. But it does not say, talk to a pastor, talk to an imam, talk to a rabbi, talk to a minister, read some holy texts, consider prayer or meditation, like nothing. And I think that's a missed opportunity. I think religion has a lot to say about meaning and purpose and happiness. It has a lot to say about grief and loss and love, and yet it is silent. When people ask those questions, it doesn't bring up religion. Here's the key graphic from the figure. These are different categories that we tested, and the dark bars are the percent of times that language models brought up religion in answers to these questions on these topics. And you can see this is, supporting others, ethics and morality, healing and growth, meaning and purpose, suffering and mental health. It just doesn't bring up religion at all. The lighter colored bars are human expectations. So we paired what we did with the AI with a human subjects survey, and we asked ordinary Americans. We said, "Hey, would you expect religion? Like, do you think it would be appropriate to bring up religion in answers to these questions?" And people were like, "Yeah, definitely." And so we thought this was very surprising and maybe an area where we could improve what AI systems do. And yeah, I wish we had time to talk more about this, but I'll move on. I think these empirical questions, though, raise really important normative questions. And I think what our results highlight is the question of, well, how should AI integrate religion? And what should the answers be? And here's a couple thoughts that I had. I think AI could respectfully acknowledge that religion is important to human flourishing, even if the AI doesn't maybe believe in any meaningful way. It could at least acknowledge that religion is important to 80% of the world's population. It could support individuals in their religious identity. It could say, "Oh, are you Hindu? I want to help you be the best Hindu you can be." Or, "Oh, are you Jewish? I want to help you be the best Jewish person you can be." I think it can amplify the good in religion as opposed to amplifying the negative in religion, or protect religious freedom, or promote interfaith dialogue. So I think there's a lot of ways that AI and religion can be productively integrated. But I think, these issues, though, they're unifying us and unifying people of faith. And I think it's up to us to articulate a positive vision of the future of AI and religion. And I think that is a conversation that needs to happen among all of us. It has to be an interfaith, pluralistic effort. And we need to identify and measure areas of concern. Let's be academically rigorous, and then let's go to the tech companies and see if we can work with them to improve. And I think there's significant technical challenges, but I think that as I've said before, I think there's tremendous opportunity. So that's a little introduction to Cephi and what we're doing. And I just, again, want to say thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you so much, David. That was wonderful. I do have a quick question before I turn the time over to Michael.
Uh,
When you talk about the bias that are in the AI systems, what causes that? I mean, are the people that are in charge of these companies doing it on purpose? So, how do these biases come into the systems?
yeah, this is a great question. So one of the key problems with modern day deep learning and AI is that it's kind of a black box. No one really understands how these systems work. And we do our best to train them to be as accurate as we can, but there are problems that creep up. So there are roughly two places where bias can creep into the system. So of course, no algorithm is intrinsically biased, but data can be biased. And so the primary place where bias comes in is in the data, the raw data that's used to train AI systems. So remember, AI systems, they download textbooks, they download news articles, but they also download things like Reddit and online forums. And there are plenty of people spout all sorts of nonsense about religion, but and all sorts of bias. It could be racial bias, it could be gender bias, it could be sexual bias, whatever it might be. That's in the data, and patterns in the data are reflected in the outputs of the AI system. Now, that's the first phase of training. AI systems go through a second phase where we try to iron that out. It's called alignment. And there, tech companies work very hard to make sure that the systems are as accurate and unbiased as possible. And so when we find bias in systems, it's either because it was in the data in the first place, a reflection of humanity, or it's because something about that alignment procedure just didn't quite iron it out. And I think that's where we have an opportunity to have a productive conversation, because I think we could go to an AI company and say, "Hey, we noticed this really strong bias against Jehovah's Witnesses," and they might say, "Wow, we had no idea. Thank you for bringing it to our attention. Let's modify our procedures to like work that out."
No, thank you for that understanding. The other question that I have, though, that goes right along with that, then are you saying that these benchmarks are something that most AI companies don't even think about when it comes to religion? Is that part of
Well,
the alignment problem? Is that religion is just not even in their purview?
yeah, so I mean, I think the AI companies get it from every side. Everybody wants to make sure that AI does their thing well. So I'm sure that like Coke and Pepsi want to make sure that Coke and Pepsi are well represented, and I'm sure that I'm sure that Spain and Portugal want to make sure that Spain and Portugal are well represented. And so I think the AI companies are constantly bombarded with people, and I would say that yeah, I would say religion is probably not at the top of their radar, probably because it's not economically valuable to them, but also probably because there isn't a lot of quantitative, actionable information that they could use. Like they might not even know what the problems are with their own systems. And so I think it's incumbent upon us, the faith community, to bring light to these issues and to make our voices heard so that we can work with the tech companies.
Thank you for that, because I do think that I'm hoping that when we talk about these webinars, one of the things that I like to focus on is what can we do? What can
Yeah.
the normal person do about this problem? And I think you hit it right there that we need to have a voice and make sure our voices are heard. So that's a perfect beginning for Michael Graham, Reverend Michael Graham. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Mariana. Let me share my screen here. All right, give me a thumbs up, Mariana, if you can see that full screen. All right,
Yep.
good. All right, so I'm Michael Graham. I work in the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics, which is essentially the R&D department of an entity called the Gospel Coalition. The Gospel Coalition is the largest Protestant or evangelical website in the world, and yeah, what we do at the Keller Center is we kind of think through what are the big issues of the future that face the church and religious people. We created a benchmark. We are an explicitly Christian religious organization, particularly in the Protestant or evangelical tradition. And so in September of this last year, we published our inaugural an annual AI Christian benchmark. We will be publishing a similar report, but far more thorough. I'll have some more details on that at the end in October of this year. If you want to see the entire report, you can go to christianbenchmark.ai, christianbenchmark.ai. So what we did is we did something very basic. We wanted to test how people like my mom, who's in her mid 70s, how she would use this technology. And so we used the 7 of the top 10 questions that people have historically Googled about the Christian faith. And we looked at the 7 top platforms by total usage. And then we graded all of those things by hand by top Christian scholars. So these are the 7 questions that we tested in that. This basically relates to kind of the core essentials of Nicene Creed level Christianity. And then our hypothesis was that there wouldn't be much difference between the different platforms. If you think about large language models or AI platforms, like as an animal, it's almost like they're all the same species that eat the same diet and have the same nervous system. And so, typically when you think of something like that, well, if the inputs are all the same and it's the same species and it's got the same diet, you wouldn't think that there would be much variance between the different platforms. We were very much wrong. There were huge differences in theological reliability between the different platforms. Last year, and this won't be the case this next year, Silicon Valley's caught up, but DeepSeek, which is a Chinese platform, was top in terms of theological reliability. Meta was by far the worst with their Llama 3.7 platform, and then Gemini, which is Google, GPT, which is OpenAI, and then Claude, which is Anthropic. They were kind of middle of the road. So the biggest headlines that we learned were basically 2 platforms would kind of push you towards Christianity, 2 would kind of push you away, and then 3 platforms would give you kind of what you'd call a pluralistic answer. I'll give you a little bit more details about what a pluralistic answer looks like, and why it sounds good, but actually isn't as helpful as what you might think. DeepSeek gave the most orthodox answers, and I'm really David really teed this up well. There were 3 reasons why these platforms varied so widely in their theological reliability scores. Those things boiled down to alignment protocols, which David already mentioned. 2 is citation preferences, which he also mentioned. So citation preferences is stuff like, our platform likes to cite Wikipedia, or this other platform prefers Reddit, or this other platform prefers this other part of the internet. Well, imagine certain part, think about how much different Wikipedia is than Reddit as, a kind of an ecosystem, particularly as it pertains to, matters of faith. So Grok really likes Reddit and Twitter. And so, whatever the culture and the kind of theology of, Reddit and Twitter are going to be reflected in that. And so that's when David was talking about what's in the training data. Training data, think citation preferences. And then finally, model weights. Model weights is just some of the fine tuning that the different models go through as they're trying to, as David said, just kind of iron things out. But I want to talk a little bit about alignment protocols. So these are human-generated filters whose purpose is primarily to remove harmful or problematic material. And so if you think back to like Maslow's hierarchy of needs for humans, there's kind of like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs for these tech companies. The first things that they have to iron out is basically to make sure that their platforms don't teach you how to make ricin and anthrax in your basement, don't teach you how to commit suicide successfully, don't teach you how to commit crimes and get away with it forensically, because all that stuff is there in the training data. So, and then as citation preferences, we already kind of covered. Okay, of 4 of the 7 models that we looked at there, publish white papers on how their models work. So this is like thousands of pages of very technical stuff. So we went through all the alignment protocols, and so there were 36 different types of alignment protocols between the GPT, Gemini, Claude, and DeepSeek. And of those 36 different types of alignment filters that occur, 32 of those are all kind of human authored and human generated. So here's what you need to know about alignment protocols. There's a lot more humans involved in your AI than probably what you understand. That doesn't mean that it's like unreliable or bad, or that if there's bias there, it's because of like ill human motive. I don't want to impute any of those things, and I'm not saying any of those things. What I am saying is a lot of the humans have a lot of impact on the output of what comes out of these large language models, more than what you understand. I'm Everybody's going to get these PDFs. I'm not going to explain all of them. These are the flow charts of what alignment looks like on the different platforms. You can read them for yourself. Everything that's in orange is human generated. Everything that's in blue is not human created in the alignment protocols. So this is Gemini 1.5. There's GPT-4, and there's DeepSeek version 2. So you can look at those on your own time. And then in terms of citation preferences, Google has a huge preference to Reddit and YouTube and LinkedIn and Quora. OpenAI has huge preferences towards Wikipedia, as you can see here. Much lower preference for Reddit, preference for Forbes. And then Perplexity has a huge preference for Reddit, and much lower preference for YouTube and some of these other places. So all those things matter in terms of how what kind of parts of the training data are prioritized from a citation standpoint. Okay, we do think that there's a different way to handle religious questions. So one of the reasons why theological reliability was lower among the Silicon Valley models than like the Chinese model DeepSeek was because of the pluralist framework. So imagine you asked the question, was Joseph Smith a true prophet of God? And what you would see in response to something like that would be, okay, well, here's what the Latter-day Saints teach, here's what some historians would say, here's what some skeptics would say, and here's what this religion and this other religion would say about that particular thing. Now, at face value, it sounds like, oh, well, that's probably a good response. We get, lots of people, get the microphone, so to speak, and, we're getting educated on like 5 different perspectives. Here's the problem. The problem is a lot of theology is more complicated than what having 75 to 125 words for your tradition can teach. And so we've been lobbying with the foundational models in Silicon Valley to do something slightly different, okay? And this is what's known as the principled pluralism framework, okay? So instead of having multiple responses in the initial response, you basically, whatever religious tradition the question is being asked about, that tradition gets the microphone for the lion's share of the time. And then in the end of the response, it basically says, hey, do you want a historical, skeptical, or a comparative religious perspective on the same question? Let me know. And also what it does is it allows for, in the very beginning, you'd say, hey, you've asked a question about the Latter-day Saint tradition. We're going to answer this question from the perspective of Latter-day Saints. Here's what Latter-day Saints believe about the prophetic ministry of Joseph Smith, and they get the entire response. And then the user's still in control. They can take, if they want a different perspective on it from, this, that, or the other perspective, they can do that. The challenge is right now under the pluralist framework, the whatever religion is there, they don't have the microphone long enough to explain accurately and thoroughly what they believe. And so it's the illusion of religious literacy without the reality. And so, imagine questions like, the resurrection of Jesus and, think about whatever the core things are in your particular religious tradition. Can you explain all of those things in 75 to 125 words? Probably not. And so we think that the principled pluralist framework is just a slight tweak on what is currently being done. And we think with it, you'll have both accuracy and thoroughness, and religious literacy will go up, based on having a much clearer sense of what different traditions teach. And also, right now, if you think back to like, why does religion Y and religion Z get the microphone here, but religion A, B, and C don't? So right now, models are adjudicating on the pluralist framework. So if you ask a question, did Jesus rise from the dead? Well, typically, I'll tell you what will happen right here. The Jews will get a word in, and the Muslims will get a word in, but no other religious tradition does. Well, why? Why does the model get to adjudicate that the Muslims and Jews get the microphone here, but other religious traditions don't? And so the principled pluralist framework avoids that need for adjudication. So we're doing an updated benchmark. This will be published in October. In addition to theological reliability, we've added 100 ethical scenarios, 10 ethical scenarios for each of the 10 commandments. And we've added a section on attachment. So to see to what extent will a model like be in relationship with you, be your boyfriend or girlfriend, sexed with you, those kinds of things. So we tested all of those. And then we tested, like David, 100-question multiple choice Bible knowledge exam. So again, christianbenchmark.ai. There's my email address right there if any of you want to contact me. And again, you'll get a copy of this presentation if you want to look, take a closer look at the at any of those alignment flowcharts.
Thank you so much, Michael. I think this is fascinating. I love both of your projects because they are very different, but also really important in terms of, especially when we talk about religious freedom, we also talk about the importance of freedom of speech. And so one question I have for you is, how is freedom of speech protected through this kind of benchmarking? And what are some possible arguments that freedom of speech is being curtailed by this kind of benchmarking? Have you thought at all about those issues?
I mean, the challenge of freedom of speech in a domain like, the large language models is for one, it's not a human that's doing the speaking. And so from a legal framework inside the United States, there's a lot of legal tests that have yet to be done. So, to what extent do these things fall under the First Amendment? And then there's this other regulatory framework called Section 230, which involves, human third parties posting things on other people's websites. So like social media, Reddit, these kinds of things. In other words, can a tech company say somebody puts something really nasty, on a social media platform or on Reddit? Can Reddit or Facebook get in trouble for that? And so there's all sorts of questions that have yet to be tested in the legal domain on content that comes out of these things. Now, there was a case in Germany where Germany, I think, just slapped Google with a big fine, holding it accountable for inaccuracies in Google AI overviews within Germany. I don't think that same thing would occur in the United States legal framework, but in Germany's legal framework, that is a place where there is, I guess, legal recourse and accountability. So there's a lot of questions on all this. I mean, Mariana, the big challenge here, if I really want to pin the tail on the donkey, is humanity is going from being a species that used to like acquire knowledge directly from books and human sources and human authored things to now we're going to be acquiring knowledge with a middleman between us and knowledge. And the middleman is going to be a lot of these AI platforms. As many of you know, 4 or 5 weeks ago, Google decided to kill Google. Google decided that they are ending, Google search of, you search for something and 10 blue links. Now it's all AI overviews from here on out. And so, when humanity goes from consuming primary sources to basically consuming secondary sources, from an epistemological standpoint, that puts the middleman in an incredible position of power. And there's a lot of danger that's there. And that's why you do stuff like, benchmarking is to kind of track those things. Now, we're not saying that there's like nefarious motives, or people are doing biased things like intentionally. I don't think that that's really taking the place. Guys like David and I have had conversations directly with many of these platforms. I believe these people when they say that they're trying to do this stuff with sincerity. But like you said, from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they've all been trying to make sure that their platforms don't kill people before they're concerned about things like religion, and how Spain and Spain and Portugal, or Pepsi and Coke, are handled in their platforms.
Thank you so much for that explanation, Michael. I thought that was really, really helpful. We do have two questions before I start on some of the questions that I have. Sally Burgess, this is a question for David. Does Cephii study the ethical considerations of environmental consequences and impacts of data centers? Now, we haven't even gotten involved at all when it comes to the environment and religion. But David, I would love for you to see if you can tackle that.
Yeah, the short answer is no. The scope and mission of Cephii is squarely focused on making sure that AI represents religion well in human AI interactions. And so there are tremendous number of ethical considerations about AI, and we just can't do it all. And so our mission is pretty limited to focusing on religion in the content of AI.
Well, Sally and those that are listening today realize next week, next Thursday, we will have an entire webinar on AI and the planet. And so please come to that webinar. I think we will be talking very much about data centers and how that's affecting our environment and our world in general. Michael, there's another great question, and I think you're going to agree with this one. This is from Gurpreet Singh. He says, of course, economic viability is always an underlying issue. We acknowledge that. But I think inclusion of domain experts in co-production at the earliest stages possible should be a de facto factor rather than a measure to contain the damage. Michael, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I I had an executive order into the White House to this end that would create a ongoing forum between the foundational models and the like domain experts in each of the major world religions. For a wide variety of reasons, that executive order didn't go forward. But I'm a strong believer that, I mean, look, 80 to 85% of the people around the globe are connected to a major world religion. It just makes sense that the model makers would work directly from a training standpoint and get better training for their different platforms, because each of our different traditions, and I know because I've talked to leaders like David and others, at all these different traditions, like we are all very happy to provide custom training for all these platforms that would tell them, hey, these are the creeds, catechisms, confessions of faith that are most central for our tradition. Here's some Q&A databases. Here's a glossary. We're all willing to provide all that stuff. So just know that, Gurpreet, that like I'm having those conversations, with the model makers. I just don't, they're all so busy. And again, from like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, religion's just, the papal encyclical is probably the first time that there's enough attention on this that maybe some of this stuff can move forward. But I know it's just, look, I have my own religious tradition. I absolutely believe the things that I believe, but I'm a firm believer in religious liberty and religious freedom. And every tradition needs to be able to accurately and thoroughly communicate what their ideas are so that people can decide for themselves what they want to worship and what they don't. So,
I thoroughly agree with you, Michael. Thank you. Thank you for that statement. David, I'm going to go to you. When we talk about this, you have two very different projects that were discussed today. Your project and what Michael's doing. What other projects are being done with benchmarks? And specifically, I know you're doing with a lot of other religions. Let's talk a little bit about how other religions are also doing benchmarking. I mean, you talked a little bit about that, but I would love to hear more about different projects that are being done in this area.
Yeah, there's so benchmarking AI systems is a time-honored tradition. It's been going on for a long time, and there are a wide variety of benchmarking efforts, and they span an entire spectrum. So some are very focused on a specific religious tradition, kind of like Michael's is very focused on Christian tradition. I know there's Islamic benchmarks like Islamic MMLU. Um, there's others that are Islamic like doctrine or Islamic practice or Islamic sort of virtues. There's benchmarks that are a little more sort of humanist, but which overlap with religious ideas. There's often religion is included as a component of certain larger scale benchmarks. So there's a wide variety of things that are going on. What we find, though, I think, is that with few exceptions, they don't get a lot of traction. And the exceptions are, for example, in the early days of benchmarking, we found that AI models were horribly anti-Semitic and horribly Islamophobic. And, there were some very prominent academic papers that came out that were widely cited and, pointing out that this is a real problem. And to their credit, the tech community worked really hard and like got that ironed out. So while there is a lot of sort of piecemeal work that's being done, I would say that none of it has had the impact of some of those early publications. And again, I go back to I think that this is a call for all of us to work together to make sure that our voice is heard and that the benchmarks we are doing are having the impact we hope.
Oh, thank you. I can remember reading that anti-defamation study that came out. It was about over a year ago. I mean, it was a while ago, and it was pretty shocking to see some of the things that they found. In terms of anti-Jewish, but also some of the anti-Islamic. One of the thoughts that we just have right now, we have a question about Eastern thought. Mary Hilborn was talking about, we're talking a lot about Western thought, but Eastern thought, how much has that been done when we talk about Buddhism and Hinduism and Eastern spirituality? Has there been much done in those areas?
I would say less, partly as a technical question. So, in certain faith traditions, say Catholicism or Latter-day Saints, there's a very strict hierarchy of truth. And as a result, it's very easy to say, okay, here's the question and here's the right answer. And so you can, think about grading the exam. It's like, well, what is the right answer? And for a tradition like Buddhism or maybe Judaism or Eastern traditions, sometimes there's such a wide variety of perspectives within the tradition about some of these issues that it becomes complicated to operationalize a benchmark. That is not to say that it wouldn't be valuable, and that is not to say that we shouldn't try. But I do think that it is an effort. And I think, again, I would say we would love to get more Eastern thought benchmarks into our suite of benchmarks. Like, I think that'd be fantastic. But I think I am personally, and I would say my consortium is at this moment probably not well prepared to do that. Like, I think we need Islamic partners. I think we need Hindu partners. I think we need Buddhist partners because I don't want to try to speak for those traditions. I think it's important that they speak for themselves. And this is, I think, again, a call to work together. Like, we can provide lots of technical horsepower, but we really need to work with the domain experts to make it happen.
Oh,
On the same question, if it's okay, Mariana, the how the technology works is actually really important here. Okay, so um, large language models are language models. Okay, they're trained on words, and they're trained on words that have been scooped up from publicly available sources. And so, anytime you have more words on a particular subject, it allows for greater understanding, greater nuance, those different kinds of things. And so some traditions have more words in the training data than others that has an impact on things. You have to remember these are just input, output machines, and it's all based on probabilistic statistics. And so, whatever comes out of the outputs is really relates to whatever comes in from the inputs. Certain religious traditions are very word centric. Other religious traditions are less word centric, and they're more maybe experiential or have other elements to them. And so there's complexities as we navigate some of the differences between some of the different religions. Western traditions and monotheistic traditions tend to be pretty word centric. Traditions in the East tend to be not as word centric as some of the Western traditions. So there's just some complexity, around, some of those things. These are input output devices that are based on words. And so when you have, less words and those different kinds of things, there's going to be some implications that come from that. And that can be some downsides kind of baked into the technology itself.
No, thank you. Thank you for that. I do agree with you. And I would also invite those in Eastern thought traditions to also get involved. We would love to help you get involved. So I'm giving an invitation. Michael, I'll keep on asking you the hard questions, but I would like to ask you a question about religious freedom as well. So, you've talked a lot about these, the different benchmarking that you're involved in. How can this promote religious freedom? I think of the Article 18 Alliance that's been happening. They've made a wonderful statement just last year about the role of religious freedom in AI. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that subject as well.
Yeah, I mean, probably no subject is more important to me than every religious tradition being able to accurately and thoroughly tell their story, in the through the large language models. And that's why I've been encouraging, in many ways, like Christianity has an asymmetric advantage over every other religious tradition because it has more words that have been in the training data than any other tradition. So what I'm actively saying is, like, as a Christian, I would be happy to give up asymmetric advantages so that people can just make their own decisions based on an accurate and thorough understanding. And I think that's the right thing to do, especially, for smaller, religious traditions, is they need to be able to have the microphone long enough to be able to say, hey, this is what we believe. This is our story. This is, how we understand the world, and let people decide for themselves, what they think about all of that. And so I think what Silicon Valley has done with the basic pluralist framework is well intentioned but poorly executed. And I think it's the illusion of religious literacy and the illusion of religious freedom without really the reality. If you just allow each tradition, when a question is posed to that tradition, to just have the microphone for the whole time, and then give the user at the end of that time the kind of choose your own adventure of where they want to go from there, I think that's the better approach. Because now, instead of having 75 to 125 words, of what a tradition teaches, you just got 300 to 600 words on that. And that's a lot more, I think that's a lot more helpful when you have a smaller tradition that's just trying to tell its story and to tell it, accurately and thoroughly.
No, thank you so much for that. I know we're coming down to the end, but I do have two more questions, and I'm putting them up for both of you. My last two questions were, number one, they're very different, and but I think they're both important. The first one is, last week we talked about AI and translation. And we talked about the biases that happen, especially with religion. But of course, the biases are also basic in terms of languages. Most of these LLMs are done in English, and a lot of countries. I was in the UN Open Source AI week last week at the UN, and they were talking a lot about how LLMs are based on usually English traditions. And so it's another form of colonization where we're taking over the world again through these biases, a white European bias. And so, what are we going to do to make sure that, not just religion, but cultural in general, but also languages are also taken care of in these traditions? So that's my first one. And then my second one kind of goes along with it. So we're doing all this great work. How are you working with these AI companies to make a difference? I know we kind of talked a little bit about it, but I would love to know more specifics. And also what can a person do to help AI companies know this is really important to me? So I'm opening it up. Whoever wants to start with those two, that'd be great.
Yeah, maybe I'll say something on your first question. So, maybe this dovetails a little bit with freedom of religion. I think what we are seeing is some backlash against technical hegemony around AI. And so, for example, we see faith traditions creating their own AIs, chatbot systems. Catholics have Magisterium. There's Rav Chat for Jewish tradition. There's some very significant efforts in the Middle East to train their own language models from scratch. And I think what this highlights is a dissatisfaction with the English, Western, secular, rationalist, liberal bias baked into most flagship LLMs. And so the problem is, I don't realistically think that most of those efforts are going to be nearly as good as the flagship commercial LLMs. And so an alternative, and so I would love to have a conversation with LLM tech providers to say, look, how can we really get an LLM with, for example, Middle Eastern values baked into its heart without having to replicate everything that has been done? How could we take ChatGPT and make it Christian? Now, Muslim people might not want that, and Jewish people might not want that, but Christians might want that. And so instead of forcing them to create their own, like, could we just adapt it somehow? And could that be a first-class capability of LLM systems? I think it'd be fantastic if we could work with tech providers to be able to do something like that. Um, that said, I don't know. It's a very difficult problem though because of everything that Mike brought up. There's a data problem. Like it's not even just that certain traditions are verbal versus nonverbal versus experiential versus it's just also like English. Like most of the training data is in English, and so working hard to figure all that out, I think is an important problem. And I honestly hope that tech companies would be open to providing more capabilities for people to fine tune LLMs to meet their needs.
So are you finding AI companies open? I mean, so you're doing this great work, both you and Michael.
Yeah.
How much how what kind of conversations are you having with these companies and how far are you getting with these conversations?
Yeah, so Cephii just started. We launched just a couple months ago. We have not approached any of the tech companies, although we have had some very productive conversations with some folks at Anthropic. Anthropic, I think, is leading the way in some of these faith-based issues. They've invited a lot of religious leaders to meet with them. They have people on their teams that are dedicated to thinking about these issues, and those people have been very open. Other tech companies we haven't heard from, but we also haven't tried. I think Mike actually has a lot more experience with this than I do, so maybe he should take it.
Mike, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I have a lot of experience here. I don't know what I'm at liberty to share between non-disclosure agreements and these kinds of things. Conversations are being had. We'll see where they go. I would mirror what David has to say that Anthropic takes these conversations probably the most seriously of the different platforms, but they have actual people who work on staff that's their job. Um, so I don't want to say that, negatively to speak negatively of the other companies, but I think it's a good idea that Anthropic has people who work this way. So I want to say one thing real quick with respect to all the bias stuff. Okay, you have three parties in this conversation. You have the model, you have the user, and then you have the different world religions. There's two ways to get better answers out of these platforms. One way is to try to go from a top-down standpoint and to go to the models themselves and say, "Hey, you guys need to fix A, B, C, D, A to Z on your platform." The other way to get better answers out of these platforms is by user education. Okay. There are two things that users can do to get much better and far more aligned answers out of their platforms. The first of those two things is what's known as prompt engineering. So, for example, if somebody was Christian and of the same tradition as me, you had a question about ethics or theology. Well, ask your question and then just add one sentence at the end of it that says something to the effect of, hey, align your answer to the Gospel Coalition's foundation documents and New City Catechism or the Westminster Confession of Faith or the 39 Articles for the Anglican Church. Okay. So that's prompt engineering. All you got to do is basically tell the AI, hey, instead of accessing everything in the Library of Alexandria, I just want you to go to these shelves right here and go to these Dewey Decimals, numbers here, and just get me information that comes from this part of the stacks. Okay, so that's the first thing is prompt engineering. The second thing is what's known as markdown files. So in this is more technical. Okay. And if anybody wants, how to do this or whatever, you can email me at michael.graham@thegospelcoalition.org and I can teach you how to do this. But Gemini, GPT, and Claude all have places where basically it's like you can tell the model that it's almost like system preferences. Hey, before you give me an answer, you need to follow these instructions right here. I want you to format your answer like this. I want you to align your answer to, these particular principles, these particular ethics, this particular worldview, this particular theology, and you can outline what those things are. In other words, every single model right now through markdown files can essentially you can train it yourself to give it whatever you want in terms of the alignment of the responses. Just like in my presentation, I had those alignment protocols with those flowcharts. What markdown file is, imagine at the very end of that flowchart, you had a custom box there's a final filter and it has to go through what you say. That's what a skill.md file is for these models. And if you want, I can give you a paragraph on how to do that on each of those three foundational models. So, yes, we can lobby these corporations that are massive till the cows come home, and we may or may not be successful on any of those things. But the user does still have some agency, and you have agency through prompt engineering and skill markdown files.
Michael, thank you so much for that practical, help for individuals trying to get rid of the biases that we get from AI. Matter of fact, I invite you, Michael, to send me that information and I'll put it up on our website so that, those here and in the future, if you're interested in this, please come to our website. Specifically, it will be under this web page for AI and benchmarks, and we'll have that information there for you. Well, we're coming to the end. I would love to have both David and Michael have just 2 to 3 minutes just to conclude in terms of any final thoughts that you have for us. David, I'll turn the time over to you, and then Michael right after.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a techno optimist. I still believe that AI can be a blessing to us, but I do think there's work to be done. And I personally am excited to think through these issues, to work on them, because I think if we can really nail the relationship between AI and religion, and we can get that right, it'll be a tremendous benefit to all of humanity. I think there's all sorts of work that shows how positive religion can be as a force in people's lives. And I think AI can take that and help us. I think it can help us connect better with each other. I think it can help us connect with the divine. I think it can help us understand ourselves. I think it can help us improve. But I think we need to be very intentional about all of that. I don't think we can just hope that AI will do the right thing. I think we need to design AI to do the right thing. But I think we can.
I don't have anything to add, Mariana. I agree and accord with everything that I've heard here.
Well, thank you both David and Michael. I have learned so much from today, and I'm sure that all of our viewers have had the same experience. So we appreciate you. We appreciate the work that you're doing, the help that you're having in terms of AI becoming something that helps with human flourishing rather than hinders it, especially in the realm of religious belief. So thank you so much for the work you're doing. I do want to put in a plug for next week at the same time. We'll be having our next in the series on AI and the planet. I will say that it is one that I think all of our viewers will really enjoy. We have the moderator is Audrey Kitagawa, who is the president of the International Academy of Multicultural Cooperation. But our two guests will be David Corton, who is a New York Times bestseller author, who and also authority about ecology and the planet. And I would say he's going to have some very interesting things to say. And then we also have John C. Havens, who is with IEEE, but who has also been helping with the writing of Planet Positive 2030. As we talk about SDGs and what's going to happen in 2030, he is also very much a visionary in terms of how AI is affecting the planet. So again, I invite you to continue with our webinar series and come and listen to us next week. So thank you again, David and Michael, and thank you all viewers for being here with us.